The ancient forest stood silent under the light of two suns and Kelith Moonshadow. Did not trust the silence one bit because she had lived too long and seen too many wars to believe that peace could last forever, and her hand rested on the neck of Vorthax, who was her dragon companion, and together they stood on top of an old broken tower that gave them a view of the land. Stretching far to the east, the dragon was huge with scales that shone copper red in the fading light, and his eyes were like those of a hunting cat with pupils that were thin lines as he watched the horizon, and Kelith had found him 400 years ago, when he was just a baby dragon in the smoking ruins of the Sky Citadel, and they had been together ever since, fighting side by side through wars and peace, and the bond between them was deeper than words could express. Kelith whispered to her dragon, asking if he could feel something wrong in the air because her pointed elf ears were picking up strange vibrations, and the energy around them felt different, like it had not felt since before the great silence fell across the galaxy. Many thousands of years ago, Vorthax made a deep rumbling sound in his chest that Kelith could feel through her whole body because he felt it too, and something was definitely wrong with the world today. The Council of Eternal Races had left Earth 50,000 years before, and they had abandoned all the humans to die in the fires of their nuclear wars, and the Council said it was mercy to let them die quickly, instead of letting their violence spread to other worlds. And Kelith had been young back then, only 200 years old, and she had been part of the group that voted to leave the humans behind. She remembered the screams and the ships that were supposed to rescue people but never came, and the way the Council vessels just disappeared from the sky, while clouds of radiation rolled over the continents below, and all the humans were left to burn and die alone, the elves and the dragon people and the crystal beings called Vetherai had all agreed that humans were too dangerous and too wild and too likely to destroy themselves, so it was better to let them fade away than to risk them spreading their chaos to the peaceful stars. But now, after 50,000 years of silence, something was moving in the empty space between the stars. Kelith looked at her wrist device, and the readings made her blood run cold because the sensors were showing massive disturbances in space itself and energy signals that were bigger than anything the Council fleets had ever made, and all of these signals were moving toward Council space from the direction of where Earth used to be after 50,000 years of absolute silence. Humanity had somehow returned, Kelith spoke into her communication device, telling Commander Hayden to get the Third Fleet ready immediately because hostile ships were coming, and she believed they might be from Earth. Before she could finish her sentence, the sky itself tore open. It was not slow or gentle, but sudden and violent, like someone had ripped a hole in reality itself, and through that hole came ships, and not the primitive metal vessels that old Earth used to build, but something far more terrifying, and these ships were sleek and dark and humming with power that made Vorthax snarl and spread his wings wide. Hundreds of ships descended like falling stars, and each one was larger than the biggest warships the Council had ever constructed, and their hulls had markings in a language that Kelith recognized with growing horror because it was English but evolved and changed over thousands of years, but still unmistakable. The lead ship had a name painted across its side in letters that glowed with captured starlight, and the name was Remember, and Kelith felt her heart sink because she understood what that name meant, and she whispered that the humans had survived against all odds. The communication channels exploded with panic as Council sensors finally detected what her eyes had already seen, and every military base within many star systems was scrambling to respond, but Kelith could see it was already too late, because the human fleet had positioned itself perfectly and emerged from their jump through space with precision that showed careful planning and technology. It should have been impossible for a species that was left to die in primitive conditions. Transmissions suddenly cut through all the panic and chaos, and it was a single voice that somehow took over every secured channel that the Council had. And the voice was calm and measured and carried the weight of 50,000 years of anger. The voice said it was Fleet Admiral Kate Morrison of the Terran Reclamation Force, and she was broadcasting on all frequencies. And she had a message for the Council of Eternal Races, and the message was simple, because humanity remembered everything. Channel stayed open for 3 heartbeats of complete silence. Admiral Morrison continued speaking, and said that humanity remembered all the promises that Council had made, And they remembered the rescue ships that never came. And they remembered the children who burned while the council watched from orbit. And they remembered every single council member who voted to leave them behind them. Admiral said that 50,000 years was a very long time to perfect the art of remembering, and it was. An even longer time to prepare for payback. Felt her hands shaking as she watched the human ships take positions around the planet, and Warthax pressed against her side trying to comfort her, but she barely noticed because she was counting ships and analyzing weapons and calculating power levels and coming to a conclusion that made her feel sick. The council could not win this fight, and not today, and possibly ever. Kelith said quietly to Vorthax that they needed to get to the council chamber immediately, because if there was any chance of preventing total destruction, it had to start with telling the truth about what really happened 50,000 years ago. The dragon looked at her with his golden eyes, and she saw her own desperate hope reflected back at her, because they had both lived through too much death and too much war, and if there was even the smallest chance of preventing another massacre, they had to try, even if it meant standing against her own people living. If it meant facing the guilt she had carried for 50,000 years. Vorthax launched from the tower with a roar that shook the ancient trees, and his wings caught the wind as Kelith held tight to his scales, and behind them, the sky filled with more and more ships, and ahead of them the council fortress rose like a crystal mountain against the darkening sky. There, war had started whether anyone wanted it or not, and Kelith Moonshadow, who was the last living witness to the abandonment of humanity, was about to become the bridge between two civilizations that had every reason to destroy each other completely. She just hoped desperately that she was not already too late to save anyone. The council chamber was 30,000 years old, and it supposed to be a monument to wisdom, but today it only showed chaos, and the walls were made of living crystal that had been grown over many centuries, and each piece of crystal held the recorded history of 1,000 worlds. But today, those walls only reflected panic and confusingness. Burst through the main doors with Vorthax right beside her, and the dragon was so big that he barely fit through the entrance that was designed for more dignified arrivals, and every eye in the huge chamber turned to look at them, and there were hundreds of council members from a dozen different species, and their faces showed everything from shock to anger at this breach of Proto-Coccolith. Did not wait for permission to speak, and she announced in a loud voice that the humans were here, in orbit around 7 major worlds, including this one, and they were demanding to speak with the full Council. Lord Commander Theron was an elf almost as old as Kelith herself, and he stood up from his seat at the high table, and his face looked like it had been carved from stone by centuries of military service, but she could see him thinking and calculating behind his ancient eyes, and he said that it was impossible because the humans died 50,000 years ago. So whatever was out there must be using their identity as some kind of trickolith. Walked forward with Warthax, clicking his claws on the polished floor, and she said firmly that there was no trick because she had analyzed their transmissions and their technology signatures and even their language patterns, and it was really them, and the humans had survived somehow, and they had been preparing for this moment ever since the council left them to die. A crystal creature called a Vathari made sound like breaking glass, and said that surely the humans did not mean to attack because the council could destroy their primitive forces before they even got close. Kelith laughed, but it was not a happy sound, and she asked if they could really destroy the human forces, and told them to look at the readings, because each human ship put out more power than an entire council space station, and their jump technology was decades more advanced than anything the council had, and they had appeared at the same time across 7 different star systems, which meant their coordination was perfecta. New voice joined the conversation, and Kelith turned to see Commander Helen Hayden, who was half human and half elf, and she commanded the 3rd Fleet, and Helen was one of the few survivors of the evacuation because a kind elf officer had pulled her from Earth when she was just a baby, and Helen had spent her whole life proving her loyalty to the council, but now her face showed no emotion at all. Helen said that Kelith was right, and she had been looking at the tactical data, and if the humans wanted to, they could have already destroyed every major installation. The council had, but they had not fired a single shot, and they were waiting. Theron demanded to know what they were waiting for. Helen pointed to the chamber and said they were waiting for this, and waiting for the council to talk, and waiting for the council to answer for what was done, the room suddenly felt much colder, and no one spoke because those words were never said out loud in the council chamber, and the abandonment of Earth was written down in history files as a necessary strategic decision, and it was called an unfortunate but justified action, and to call it what it actually was meant, calling it murder by neglect, and that was political suicide. But before anyone could respond, the holographic system turned on without anyone asking for it, and a human woman appeared above the central platform, and she was 30 feet tall and perfectly clear, and Fleet Admiral Kate Morrison looked like she was in her 40s, with gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that had seen terrible things. Admiral Morrison said that she was speaking to the Council of Eternal Races, and she thanked them for making time to see her. And she knew they were all very busy pretending the last 50,000 years did not happen. Theron stood up, and power seemed to radiate from him like heat, and he said this was a violation of every diplomatic rule, and the Admiral needed to stop the transmission immediately and submit her ships to the Council inspection, or the Council would be forced to take action. The Admiral smiled, but her smile was colder than the empty space between stars, and she asked what the Council would do, and asked if they would abandon humanity again, because that trick only worked once, and humanity had spent 50,000 years making sure it would never happen again. Eclith watched with her heart pounding hard, because this was the moment where either peace or total war would be decided. Helen Hayden stepped forward, and her voice was steady, and she asked what the humans wanted. Admiral Morrison looked at Helen, and something changed in her expression, and maybe it was recognition, or maybe pity, and she said that was an excellent question, and she would tell them a story first. The hologram changed to show Earth as it was 50,000 years ago, and the planet was dying and wrapped in nuclear winter, and its surface was covered with scars from bombs and radiation, but the image zoomed in to show something the Council never documented, and it showed the survivors. Morrison continued and said that when the Council left, there were about 500 million humans still alive, and most of them were in underground bunkers and military bases and submarines, and the Council condemned them all to death, assuming that without help and without access to the galaxy, they would simply fade away within a few generations. Image changed to show crude underground cities and food gardens lit by failing fusion reactors, and children being taught in bunkers by the light of old computers. Morrison said that humans had this annoying habit of refusing to die when it was convenient for others, and they survived and adapted and built new civilizations in the deep places of Earth, and eventually they clawed their way back to the surface, and it took 5,000 years, but they did it. Kelleth felt tears in her eyes, and she had never known any of this, because the Council had sealed off the Earth system and declared it a dead zone and simply moved on to other things. Morrison said that then they found something, and the image shifted to show ancient alien structures hidden under the ice of Antarctica, and it was technology older than even the Council itself, and these were the forerunners who came before even the eternal races, and they left behind gifts and knowledge and technology that the Council had forgotten or never knew existed. The hologram changed one more time to show text in a language so old that even Kelleth barely recognized it, but a translation appeared below the ancient words, and it said that those who survived the crucible of abandonment have earned the right to inherit our legacy. Morrison said that now she would answer the question about what humanity wanted, and they wanted justice and recognition that what the Council did was not strategic necessity, but moral failure of the worst kind, and they wanted payment for 50,000 years of isolation and suffering, and they wanted a formal apology broadcast across every world in Council space, and they wanted a seat at the table equal to any race with full voting rights and veto power. Though chamber erupted into chaos, and representatives shouted over each other, and some demanded the humans be destroyed immediately, and others called for negotiation, and still more just denied that any of this could be real. But Kelleth was not listening to them because she was watching Helen Hayden and seeing the struggle on her face, and watching Theron and seeing the calculation in his eyes, and the way he was already preparing to order the fleet to Attakilith, said loudly that no, they would not make that mistake again, and her voice cut through the chaos with the weight of her many centuries. She stepped forward and put herself between the hologram and the council, with Vorthax spreading his wings wide to make the point clearer. Keleth said that she was there and she was on the evacuation committee and she voted to leave the humans behind and she had carried that guilt for 50,000 years and she would not let the council add another crime to that terrible mistake. Theron started to speak angrily, but Keleth interrupted him. She said she dared to do this because someone had to finally tell the truth. And the truth was that the council was wrong, and they were cowards who abandoned billions of thinking, feeling beings because they were afraid. And now, humanity had returned, not with primitive weapons, but with power that could crush the council, and they were not asking for destruction, but asking for what they should have always had, which was recognition and respect and justice. Silence fell over the chamber, and even Morrison looked surprised. Keleth turned to face the admiral and said to give the council 1 week and 7 days to prepare a formal response, and in exchange, she asked that the humans hold their fire and allow diplomatic channels to open, and she could not promise that the council would agree to everything, but she could promise that she would spend every moment of those 7 days fighting to make them understand what they took from humanity. Morrison studied her for a long time, and Keleth felt the weight of those ancient human eyes measuring her finally. The admiral agreed to 1 week, but she said that humanity had waited 50,000 years, and these 7 days would determine whether they waited longer or took what they were owed by fourths. The hologram disappeared and left the chamber in shocked silence. Keleth turned to face the council, knowing she had just made herself a target, and knowing half of the war room beneath the council fortress was a place of cold efficiency, with walls lined with tactical displays showing the positions of both council and human fleets, and Keleth stood before the largest screen with Vorthax coiled beside her, like a guardian as she reviewed the intelligence reports that had arrived over the past 3 days. The news was not good at Alcarnalisa. Grant was the chief strategic analyst for the council, and she explained while highlighting various data points that the humans were not just advanced in technology, but they were fighting with a level of coordination that suggested either a hive mind or quantum-linked command structure, and every ship responded to threats instantly with no communication delay, and it was like fighting a single living organism spread across 7 star systems. Hayden leaned against the war table, and her expression showed deep concern. And she said that the humans had not attacked even once, and when the third fleet performed reconnaissance maneuvers near their vessels, the humans simply adjusted position to maintain defensive formation, and it was almost like they were proving a point. The door made a hissing sound as it opened, and Lord Commander Theron entered, and his face looked carved from stone, and he said that the council had reached a preliminary decision. Keleth turned to face him, and her hand moved without thinking to rest on Vorthax's neck, and the dragon made a low rumbling sound, sensing the tension in the air. Keleth said that they were going to refuse, and she already knew the answer. Theron replied with careful, neutral tone that the majority position was that giving in to human demands would destabilize the entire council structure, and to admit wrongdoing would open them to demands for payment from every species they ever had conflict with, and to grant humans full voting rights would give Earth veto power over decisions that affected thousands of worlds, and the political ramifications would be sever. A Keleth voice cracked like a whip, and she said to forget the political ramifications because they were talking about preventing a war that could destroy everything the council had built over 100,000 years. Theron stepped closer, and his ancient eyes met hers, and he asked if they were really talking about preventing war, or were they talking about her trying to make herself feel better about her guilt by sacrificing the stability of galactic civilization. Accusation hung in the air like poison, and Keleth felt Vorthax tense beside her, preparing to defend her if needed, but she held up a hand to stop him. She said yes simply and clearly, and said yes, she carried guilt for what she helped do 50,000 years ago, but that did not make her wrong about this. And Theron had seen the human capabilities, and if the council forced them to take what they wanted through violence, then millions would die, possibly billions. And she asked if that was really better than admitting a mistake before Theron could respond. The tactical display suddenly filled with new alerts, and Colonel Grant's fingers moved quickly across the holographic interface, pulling up sensor readings that made Keleth's blood run cold. Grant announced that they had movement, and the human fleet was repositioning. And then she stopped and said something that sounded like a prayer, though. Display showed what had caught her attention, and the human vessels were moving into formation around Earth itself, which they had reclaimed and restored over the past 1,000 years, but more than that, they were activating something big, huge. Structures emerged from the planet's surface, and these were ancient Forerunner installations that had been dormant for ages beyond counting, and they connected to the human ships through beams of pure energy, and the power readings that resulted were beyond anything in all of Council records. Helen asked what that was, and her voice was barely a whisper. Keyleth said it was a weapon, and recognition came to her with horrible certainty, and she said they had weaponized the Forerunner technology. And if they activated that at full power, then she trailed off. She did not need to finish the sentence because everyone in the room understood what it meant, and a weapon powered by technology older than the Council and improved by 50,000 years of human work and anger could destroy not just fleets, but entire star systems. The communication channel opened. Without anyone asking, an Admiral Morrison's face appeared on all the screens. She said that she was speaking to the Council of Eternal Races, and her voice had none of the diplomatic politeness from their first meeting, and she said they had intercepted the Council preliminary decision to refuse the human demands, and she wanted to make sure everyone understood what that meant. The display behind her showed Earth weapon systems powering up and energy readings climbing to levels that made the sensors scream warnings. Morrison said this was called the Forerunner Judgment, and it was the most powerful weapon system ever created by the civilization that gave birth to all thinking species in the galaxy, and when the Forerunners left, they locked it away on Earth because they judged it was the planet most likely to produce a species that would either destroy itself or grow beyond its violent nature. And for 50,000 years, humanity had studied it and perfected it and prepared it for this exact moment. Morrison's eyes were hard as diamonds, and she said that the Council had 4 days left of the 7-day deadline, and if at the end of that time they had not agreed to human terms, then humanity would demonstrate this weapon on one empty system within Council space, and just one as a warning, and then they would give the Council one more chance to negotiate before they started targeting systems with people living in them. Theron said with barely controlled rage that this was threatening mass murder, and the humans claimed moral superiority while threatening to do exactly what they accused the Council of doing. Morrison corrected him, and her voice was like ice, and she said no, they were offering the Council the choice that the Council never gave humanity, and she said negotiate and live, or refuse and face the consequences. But unlike the Council, humanity was not pretending this was mercy, and they were calling it what it really was, which was justice. The channel closed and left the war room in shocked silence. Syleth closed her eyes and felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her, and she had hoped foolishly, perhaps, that both sides could step back from the edge, but she understood now that humans had not spent 50,000 years just surviving, but becoming something harder and something capable of matching the Council coldness with their Kelith opened her eyes and announced that she was going to Earth. Helen looked at her in shock and said that was suicide because the humans would never let a Council representative onto their home world, especially not Kelith. Said with certainty that they would let her because she was there when it happened, and she voted to abandon them, and if anyone in the galaxy had the right to face their judgment, it was Herverthax. It made a sound deep in his throat that was part agreement and part concern, and his golden eyes met hers, and she felt the question through their bond asking if she was certain about this. She whispered that she had to try, and she had to at least try to make them understand that not all Council members were monsters, and some of them were willing to face what they had done. Theron shook his head and said the Council would never authorize this. Miss Yonkaloth replied that then she would go without authorization, and she said she had spent 50,000 years following Council orders and following protocols and being a good soldier in a system that abandoned billions to their deaths, and she was done with that. And if there was any chance of preventing another massacre, even a small one, she was taking it. She turned to Helen and asked if she would cover for her and give her 12 hours before reporting that she had gone. Helen stared at her for a long moment, and conflict was clear in her eyes. but finally she nodded and said 12 hours, and after that she could not. Protect Calethclith, said she knew, and she managed a small smile and said thank you. She walked toward the exit with Warthax following close behind, and Colonel Grant called out asking what she should tell people when they asked what Keleth was trying to accomplish. Caleth paused at the doorway and considered the question and said to tell them she was trying to do what the council should have done 50,000 years ago, which was take responsibility for their actions and face the consequences with dignities. She and Vorthax made their way to the private hangar where her ship waited. Keleth felt a strange sense of peace settling over her, and for the first time in centuries, she was acting not out of duty or protocol, but out of real moral convictions. Did not know if it would be enough to prevent war, but at least she would be able to face herself again. Vorthax pressed his huge head against her shoulder as they walked and offered comfort and solidarity, and whatever came next, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything. For the past 400 years behind them, the Council Fortress lit up with emergency signals as news of the human threat spread and ahead of them. Earth waited carrying 50,000 years of human memory and grief, somewhere in between. Keleth Moonshadow hoped to find redemption or at least understanding before the galaxy destroyed itself. The journey to Earth took 36 hours, even with Keleth's personal ship pushing its engines beyond what was safe and right. Vorthax spent most of the trip coiled in the cargo bay, and his presence was a comfort through their mental bond, and as they got close to the Sol system, Keleth half expected to be destroyed by automated weapons, but instead she received a single transmission on an open channel. The voice said that Council ship Twilight Memory was cleared to approach Earth on a specific path, and any change from that path would result in immediate destruction. The voice was human and female and carried no anger in it, just cold precision, and Keleth followed the instructions exactly and guided her ship through the maze of human defensive installations that surrounded their homeworld like a fortress made of metal and energy. Earth itself was both familiar and strange at the same time, because the continents were the same shape, but the scars of nuclear war had been erased and replaced by huge cities that glittered with Forerunner technology, and massive rings circled the planet, and they were covered in plants and places for people to live. And it was beautiful and terrible at once, and it was a monument to species survival against impossible odds. Her ship touched down at a landing place near what used to be called Geneva. Though the old human city was now part of a much larger place that stretched for hundreds of miles, and as the boarding ramp lowered, Keleth saw a group waiting for her, and there were a dozen human soldiers in powered armor with their weapons lowered but ready, and standing at their center was Admiral Morrison herself. Vorthax came out first, and his huge size made the soldiers tense up, but none of them raised their weapons, and the dragon took position beside Keleth, with his wings slightly spread in a protective way. Morrison said that she was addressing Counselor Moonshadow, and she admitted she did not expect this. Keleth replied that she needed to see it with her own eyes, and she gestured to the city around them and said all of this, and what the humans had built, and what the council almost destroyed. Morrison studied her for a long moment, and then said to follow her because there was something Keleth needed to see. They walked through the city, and Keleth felt her ancient heart breaking with every step, because the buildings were a mix of human creativity and Forerunner technology, and they seemed to grow from the earth while having designs older than the council itself. But it was the people that struck her most, because humans of every kind lived and worked together, and their faces showed none of the desperation and violence that had been on Earth before the abandonment. Morrison said, as if reading her thoughts, that they were not the same species the council are left behind in 50,000 years of fighting to survive and building civilization from ash and bone, changes a people, and they learned to work together because the other option was dying out completely, and they learned to think in terms of thousands of years because that was how long it took to rebuild, and they learned patience because they knew eventually they would return to the stars, and they needed to be ready. They entered a huge structure at the heart of the city. It was a memorial of some kind, and the walls were covered in names, and there were billions and billions of names, and Keleth realized with crushing certainty what she was looking at. Morrison explained quietly that this was called the Testament of Ash, and it held the name of every human who died in the years after the Council abandoned Earth, and every child who starved in the nuclear winter, and every parent who chose to give their food to their children, and every scientist who worked themselves to death trying to find a way to survive, and every soldier who held the line against raiders and cannibals, and all 500 million souls who fought to give humanity a future. Cliff legs nearly gave out, and Vorthax pressed against her side to support her weight. Shit whispered, asking why Morrison was showing her this. The Admiral replied that it was because Keleth came here alone, without weapons and without demands, and because she was willing to face them when her council would not. And Morrison said she had read Keleth file, and she knew Keleth voted to abandon humanity, but she also knew Keleth was the youngest member of that committee and barely old enough to have a vote at all, and she knew that Keleth had spent 50,000 years trying to make up for it. Morrison led her deeper into the memorial to a central room where a holographic display showed Earth as it had been during the darkest days, and Keleth watched, unable to look away, as the display showed the death of billions in slow, terrible detail. Morrison said this was what the Council thought would happen, in total extinction within a few generations, and they were almost right, because at one point there were fewer than 10,000 humans left alive, scattered across underground places that were slowly failing, and humanity should have died, and by every reasonable calculation, they should have gone extinct. The display changed to show those final survivors finding the Forerunner installations hidden beneath Antarctica. Morrison said, but they found the Forerunner legacy, and with it they found hope, and the Forerunners had been watching humanity for ages, waiting to see if humans would destroy themselves or grow beyond their violent nature, and when the Council abandoned Earth, the Forerunners judged it was time to help, but not directly, and instead by giving humans access to their knowledge. Keleth asked, with a voice barely audible, why the Forerunners would help when the Council would not. Morrison replied that it's because they recognized something in humanity, and the same thing that made them choose Earth as the location for their most powerful weapons. And humans have a capacity for incredible violence, yes, but also for incredible compassion and for self-sacrifice and for refusing to give up even when all hope is lost. And the Forerunners bet on human better nature winning out, given enough time and the right tools. The Admiral turned to face Keleth directly and said the Forerunners were right, because the humans who emerged from those dark years were different and harder, yes, but also wiser. And they learned what it truly means to be responsible for each other's survival, and they learned that strength without compassion is just tyranny, and compassion without strength is just wishful thinking. Killy said that now humanity had returned to punish the Council. Morrison's voice was firm, and she said no, and now humanity had returned to ensure it never happened again to any species anywhere, and the Council operated on a principle of abandoning those it deemed unworthy of survival, and humanity was here to challenge that principle and to force the galaxy to acknowledge that every thinking species had the right to exist, and to struggle, and to grow, even if that growth was messy and painful. She gestured to the walls of names surrounding them and said these 500 million souls died because the Council decided their lives were not worth the effort of saving, and humanity was not asking for revenge, but asking for the Council to admit that was wrong, and to admit that thinking life, all thinking life, has value, even when it is inconvenient or difficult or Terraclith felt tears streaming down her face, and they were the first tears she had cried in centuries, and Voraquith made a soft sound, pressing his head against her back. She whispered that she was sorry for all of it, and for not fighting harder, and for not refusing to vote, and for 50,000 years of cowardice disguised as duty. Morrison's expression softened slightly, and she said that Keleth's apology mattered, but it was not enough, because they needed the Council itself to acknowledge what was done, and not in some classified file buried in archives, but publicly across every world and Council space, and future generations needed to know what happens when convenience and fear are allowed to override basic moralities. Said that the Council would never agree because it operated on the principle of being always right, and to admit such a fundamental mistake would undermine the entire power structure. Morrison replied bluntly that then the power structure needed to be undermined, because that was better than another species suffering what humanity suffered, and better than the cycle continuing until the galaxy destroyed itself through accumulated callous nescalith. Straightened up and wiped the tears from her face and said that Morrison should know from reading her file that she had some influence and some allies in the council, and not many, but some, and if she went back and fought for the human cause and made this her final stand, would humanity hold off on demonstrating their weapon? Morrison considered this carefully and asked how long. Keleth would need Keleth, said 3 days, maybe 4, and enough to call in every favor she had built up over 10,000 years, and enough to force a full council assembly instead of letting Theron and his group decide for everyone. Morrison asked what would happen if Keleth Phaledkalith met the Admiral Eyes, and said then she would come back here and accept whatever judgment humanity saw fit to give her personally, and she would not hide behind council immunity or diplomatic rules, and if she could not convince them to do the right thing, then she did not deserve the protection of their lost force. Roared in protest, understanding through their bond what she was offering, but Keleth sent waves of calm and determination through their connection because this was necessary and this was right. Morrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded and said 3 days and humanity would hold position and delay the weapon demonstration, but she told Keleth to understand that the emergency council assembly met at dawn, and every representative from every member species was packed into the grand chamber, and Keleth stood at the center of the floor with Vorthax coiled beside her like a guardian spirit, and she faced the assembled might of galactic civilization. She had not slept in 3 days, and she had called in every favor and twisted every arm and appealed to every principle and relationship she had built over 10,000 years of service, and some had listened, and many had not, but she had gotten enough support to force this moment in this final reckoning. Lord Commander Theron sat at the high table, and his face was carved from stone, and he was flanked by the other military commanders who wanted war. And opposite them sat the diplomatic group led by Ambassador Maya Stone, who was a human descendant, and she had argued for generations that the council needed to address its historical crimes, and scattered throughout were the undecided ones who might still be swayed. Keleth began, and her voice was steady despite her exhaustion, and she said, she stood before them not as a military officer and not as a politician, but as a witness, and she witnessed the abandonment of Earth 50,000 years ago, and she voted for it, and she had spent every day since carrying the weight of that decision. She gestured, and holographic displays filled the chamber, showing what she had seen on Earth, and the testament of ash, and the names of the dead, and the civilization rebuilt from nothing. She said, the humans survived, and against every calculation and every prediction. They survived, and they did more than survive, because they grew, and they learned, and they became something stronger and wiser than the council gave them credit for. And now they were here, not to destroy the council, but to demand accountability. Theron interrupted and said the humans were threatening them with a weapon that could destroy star systems, and that was not asking for accountability. But Terrorist turned to face him and asked if it was terrorism, and she said, when the council abandoned Earth, had weapons that could have destroyed it completely, but they chose not to use them, and not out of mercy, but because they wanted to pretend they were not killing billions, and they told themselves that letting people die slowly was somehow more moral than killing them quickly, and at least the humans had the honesty to call their threat what it was. She turned back to the assembly and said the humans were asking for 3 things, in public acknowledgement that the council was wrong to abandon them, in payment for 50,000 years of isolation and equal representation in council governance. And these were not unreasonable demands, but the minimum requirements for justice. Crystal Vithuri, representative, made a chiming sound and said that setting such a precedent would open them to claims from every species they ever had conflict with, and the political ramifications would be sever Akilith. Interrupted and said the political ramifications of refusing would be war, and a war they could not win, and she had seen their capabilities, and they were not bluffing about the Forerunner weapon, and they had the technology to use it before the council could mount an effective response, but more than that, they had the moral high ground, and every neutral species in the galaxy would look at this situation and see exactly what it was, which was the powerful refusing to admit wrongdoing to the powerless they once hurt. She paused to let that sink in, then continued, and said, but she did not come here to appeal to their fear or their political calculations, and she came to appeal to their conscience, assuming any of them still had one. The chamber erupted in outraged sounds, but Keleth pushed on, and her voice rose above the noise. She said for 100,000 years the council had governed the galaxy on the principle that they were the wise elders and the civilized races and the ones who knew best. But what kind of wisdom abandons billions to die because they are inconvenient? And what kind of civilization values stability over justice? And what kind of elders teach their children that some lives matter less than others? She walked forward, climbing the steps toward the high table, and Vorthax followed close behind. She said she had lived for over 10,000 years, and she had seen empires rise and fall. And she had watched species evolve and expand, and in all that time and all those experiences, she had never witnessed a single act more cowardly than what they did to humanity. And they did not have the courage to help humans overcome their violence. So they left them to destroy themselves, and they did not have the wisdom to see human potential, so they condemned them to extinction. And they did not have the integrity to admit their failure, so they buried it in classified files and moved on. She reached the high table and looked each of the commanders in the eye. She said the humans were offering them something precious and a chance to acknowledge that failure and to learn from it and to become better than they had been, and they were offering the opportunity to prove that the council could admit mistakes and correct them, and if they refused that offer, and if they chose pride over justice, then they deserved whatever consequences followed therein.
Ousted.
And his ancient power radiated through the chamber, and he said she spoke of justice, but justice worked both ways, and the humans were violent and chaotic and prone to self-destruction, and the council made a calculated decision based on the evidence available at the time, and to call that a moral failure was to second-guess every difficult decision. The council Evermatikilith shouted, and her voice echoed through the chamber, and she said, good, and maybe they should second-guess those decisions, and maybe the problem with the council was that they had never questioned themselves and never admitted that they were capable of being catastrophically wrong. She turned to face the full assembly and spread her arms wide. She told them to look at her and said she was a living example of that failure, and for 50,000 years she had served the council loyally and followed its rules and upheld its authority, and all that time she knew deep in her soul that they had committed an act of monstrous callousness. But she told herself it was necessary and that the council knew best and that her guilt was just personal weakness, and she was wrong, and the council was wrong. And if they did not admit that, now they lost any claim to moral authority they ever had. Ambassador Stone stood, and her human heritage was clear in her features, and she said the diplomatic group supported Keleth's position, and they moved to grant the human demands in full and begin immediate negotiations for how to do it. Other voices joined hers, and representatives standing throughout the chamber, and not all of them, and not even close to a majority, but enough to show that Keleth's words had reached some people. But it was Helen Hayden's voice that cut through the debate, carrying the authority of someone who stood between two worlds. Helen said that as commander of the Third Fleet and the highest-ranking officer of human descent in council service, she added her support to this motion, and more than that, she offered her resignation from council military service effective immediately if the council chose war over accountability. The chamber went silent, and Helen Hayden was one of the council's most decorated officers, and her loyalty was beyond question, and her public resignation would be a devastating blow to military morale and political stability. Theron's face went pale with rage, and he started to say that Commander Hayden could not do this. Helen interrupted and said she could and she would, and she had spent her entire life proving her loyalty to the council and trying to bridge the gap between her human heritage and her service, but she would not command forces in a war against her own people, especially when the council was in the wrong, and if they chose that, Path they did it without Hertha moment, stretched out balanced on a knife edge, and Keleth could feel the tide turning and could sense the undecided representatives wavering, but it still was not enough, and they needed something more, and something that would push them over the edge. Of Orthax made the decision for Hertha. Dragon reared up and spread his massive wings to their full extent and roared. The sound shook the crystal walls of the chamber and resonated through every bone and every dazos. Body present and carried with it something primal and a reminder that dragons were ancient and powerful and not bound by politics. When the sound faded, Vorthax spoke, and his voice rumbled through the minds of everyone present with the mental resonance that made dragons legendary. He said, he was Vorthax Flameheart, last of the Sky Citadel Clutch, an elder dragon of the northern peaks, and he had lived for 600 years and long, enough to see the truth that many here wish to ignore. And the council power rested not on wisdom or justice, but on the consent of those it governed, and that consent was fading with every moment they delayed this decision. The dragon golden eyes swept across the assembly. He said he stood with Keleth Moonshadow because she had shown the courage to admit fault and to risk everything for what was right rather than what was convenient. And if the council could not match that courage, then it had lost the right to command the loyalty of those who valued honor over ease. He lowered his head to look directly at Theron and said to choose wisely, because history would remember what happened in this chamber today. Silence that followed was absolute because dragons rarely involved themselves in council politics, and when they did, their words carried weight beyond any military rank or political office.